Hi everyone, welcome to Ecole Holt Couture. I'm Jutta Holtkamp and I'm sitting in the studio at Ecole Holt Couture. So today I'm going to show you how to apply one of the many stitches that we've shown you in previous video clips, such as a back stitch, a running stitch, basting stitch, and so on. So we're going to be using the back stitch and a basting stitch and applying it on developing a French seam. Now a French seam is one of the seams that we use on our very first projects here at Ecole Holt Couture. So follow along. If you have any questions or any comments, please do leave your comments below. I'm going to show you how to hand sew a French seam. There are variations on the French seam. This is the most simple one to explain, and the reason I'm showing it to you is this is a seam that we use on our very first project. So I want to demonstrate the mechanics of how it works, and I'm using a quilting cotton. This is new fabric. I'm not using my pillowcase for this demonstration. This is a quilting cotton, which is very easy to work with. It's 100% cotton. It's very, very soft, and I'm showing you on this cotton for demonstration purposes. Okay, so let's begin with our knot at the end. Now there are other ways of anchoring a seam, but I haven't shown you that yet. Let's just begin with a knot, and I'm using contrasting threads so you can see what I'm doing. I'm also oversizing the stitching so that you can see what I'm doing. First of all, or secondly, we're going to align our cut edges together. And this is one method of creating a French seam. Like I said, there are other variations, but this is the most simple one. So whether your cut edges are straight or whether they're curved, it doesn't matter as long as you align your edges. And then you are going to pin out your seam allowance. Now this is, again, oversized seam allowance. You don't normally need to make it this wide for a French seam. Okay, let's just perhaps go this way because my hands won't be in the way of what I'm showing you. What I'm doing is I'm pinning out my seam allowance. I don't have thread tracing to go by here, so I am pinning out my stitching line. Now if you were doing this by machine, which we also do, and I will show you in due course, we would still go through this same process. Okay, so I'm pinning out a line that I can follow while I'm sewing it. It's not permanent, it leaves no marks. Begin by bringing out your thread from the end and take a back stitch and go forward. Okay. So we've created our first stitch with the knot at the reverse side. Now I'm going to use a running back stitch for this first seam line. And there is a reason why this seam doesn't need as much strength as the second seam. A French seam is a two-step process, and it is used to conceal all the raw edges of a seam allowance. It is very, very useful for garments that are laundered quite a lot, because it keeps all those raw edges in place and they go undisturbed for the life of the garment. The other application that French seams are very useful for is for very delicate fabric, such as organza or georgette, in which case the seam lines do appear through the face of the fabric. So it's a very clean way of creating a very strong seam for transparent materials, or translucent, I should say. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and finish this first seam line with a running back stitch. Now for this, I'm also demonstrating a variation on the back stitch where you pick up 2 running stitches and then a back stitch. So this is for a seam that doesn't require a lot of strength. There are variations on the back stitch, as I was saying earlier. Okay, so whatever you do, stay consistent with. I'm just showing you variations on the same seam. I don't think that I would actually apply different stitches throughout the seam unless there was a very good reason for it. And the reason that I'm showing you variations on this particular seam is just so that I can demonstrate the different variations on a running back stitch seam. And again, it's in brown thread so that you can see the contrast of the thread to the fabric. All right, now I am ending my stitching line, and I'm going to end it with a knot. So to create the knot, just put the needle through the loop, put your finger down where you want it to end, and just pull. And there is the knot. Very, very, very tiny knot. Okay, so we can clip the end of that, and that is the end of the seam. Okay, so the next step in couture sewing is that we would press this seam. And you think, well, what for? It's flat. And one thing I can't express enough is how it should feel when it is stitched. Okay, so I've got my stitching line. Just run your fingers across that stitching line. You can feel that there is definitely stitching there. And use your fingertips and just pay attention to what that feels like. And on the reverse side you can see as well there is a definite texture to that. So we're going to press that using a steaming cloth, and then I want you to go ahead and feel that again. It should feel almost imperceptible. It should feel flatter and smoother. And I think I mentioned this term once before. It should feel polished. Okay, so this is the only opportunity that we'll be able to have to get that smooth feeling of that seam. Right, so in preparation for pressing, I have my steam iron, and it's set at one of the hottest settings. It doesn't have any water in it, so I'm not using it as a steam iron. I'm just using it at its hottest setting, which is recommended for cotton and linen. And I also have a pressing cloth, and if you don't know what that is, refer to our little video on pressing cloths. This is really, really well used, and it's gone a bit gray over the time. It was white, but it's clean. And I've run it under water and pressed out the water as much as possible, so it's just very, very damp, and that's what we're looking for. Then I'm going to just fold over the edge of my cloth because it gives me double the steam, and I'm going to put it over the edge of my fabric just on the seam allowance, not this way, because run the risk of getting your garment damp and watermarked. So just covering the seam allowance on the seam, and then you're going to use your steam iron and just use the tip. Just use this end of it, not the whole thing. You have more control just using the front edge, and just go along and press down, and you can hear the steam, and that's what you want to hear. Okay, so now it's still damp, and we're going to go back over our seam, what we have just stitched. Okay, now run your fingers across that. It will feel, you'll still feel it, but you won't feel it as textured. It will be much, much smoother and more polished. Now, you're going to do the same thing from the other side of the seam. And you think, well, why bother doing it twice? It's pressed. It isn't really. It's only half pressed. Now, you're going to do the same thing with your damp ironing cloth or press cloth, and just go along your seam and press down on that stitching line. Now this holds true whether you're doing it by hand or using a machine stitched stitching. Okay, now go ahead. All right, so what we've done, we've flattened out that seam, we've set that seam, and it's now ready for the next step. So now I have my sleeve board, and if you have a sleeve board, use it at this time, because what I've just created is very much like a sleeve, and there's really no better way to press it than using a sleeve board. So I'm going to run this portion of my seam over the sleeve board, and then I'm going to press it again. I'm going to press this seam apart like a flat felt seam, and I'm just going to use the tip of my iron again. Use the pressure of your own arm on this. It's not so much in the weight of the iron, but the pressure that you're putting onto the seam. So to press something properly, it has everything to do with the heat setting and the pressure of the iron, and also if you have your steam cloth and you say, but it's good enough. No, it isn't good enough. It's good enough after it's been steam pressed, because you will feel the difference. And that is the difference between couture and homemade or... Okay, now feel that seam. It's very, very smooth, and it's pressed properly. Now you're going to go to the other side. Go to the front side. All right, now we go to the other side, and you can feel the seam, but it still feels a little bit rough in my experience. Now you're going to use the same application again with pressing. Okay. The pressing cloth doesn't need to be as damp at this point. Now go across and feel that, and that is so much smoother, and there shouldn't be any buckling of the seam. If there is, you want to make sure to get that buckling out first. All right, so that looks like a finished seam, but it isn't in terms of a French seam. The next step for a French seam is that we're going to fold this back on itself, right on that seam, and we're going to press it again right on that seam, very, very precisely. We're going to press that, and here you're going to anchor one end of your seam to your sleeve board, and you're going to anchor the other end and take it in sections if you have a very long seam. Now you're going to use the tip of your iron again, just using the tip, just this much, and you're going to direct your heat source and just press down, creating a crease on that stitching line. Now you can see that there's all of these stitches because I've sewn it in brown. Well, the idea is so that you can see it. If you use a matching thread, of course, it will disappear. Okay, that is the next step. And you can also finish that off using your pressing cloth. And in couture, that pressing cloth is always there, ready to use. It protects the fabric. It gives it the amount of moisture that it needs. Now, if you go back over, just run your fingers along that. You'll feel the difference from before to after. Okay, so now we're ready for the next step. Now, I am going to hold this up closer. You can see where that seam allowance ends. Can you see there's a shadow line? All right, so that is where we are going to place our finishing stitches. Okay, now for French seams, this is very much oversized. Typically for a French seam, they're much narrower, and you can make it as wide or as narrow as is practical and for the purpose it's being made. So the purpose of this demonstration is just to show you the mechanics of a French seam. So this French seam, the next step is I'm going to mark out with my pins or a marking line where my next stitching line will go. Here you can see I've marked out where my next sewing line will go, and it is just beyond the seam allowances that are trapped in between the two layers in a straight line. That is where my finishing stitching will go. So I began by pinning it out. I'm following it up with a basting line. And you say, well, why bother doing both? Well, you can, of course, do your finished stitching with the pins in, but you do risk losing them if it's a very long seam. With a marking line or a basting line that's also a marking line, there's no risk of you losing your marks. And it's also great if you're doing a fitting and you just want to test out to make sure that this seam is in the right place before you do your final stitching, that it's in the right place. Now, you'll say, okay, now how does this work? Okay, so what I didn't tell you was that a French seam, you begin by putting the reverse sides of the fabric together, so it's counterintuitive. And because we turn it back on itself, this is actually the finished face of the fabric. Although with quilting cotton, unless it has a pattern on it, you can't tell which is the face and which is the inside. But for the purposes of just showing you how a French seam works, this is how it works. So it turns back on itself, and the raw edges are encapsulated in this width of the seam, and they are forever trapped inside, and they will never fray. And it's also a very, very strong seam in the end. There is another seam that we use that is very strong as well. It's a capped seam or a half-lapped seam, and we use it where a very strong seam is required and where the fabric isn't too thick so it doesn't create a lot of bulk either. So there's two issues. We need to have it strong and not bulky. Okay, so that was the next step. From here, I'm going to follow that up, and I'm going to, let's say I've put this away for several days or after a fitting and everything is fine. I'm going to come back and follow that up with my finished stitching. I'm going to use a back stitch, a continuous back stitch, so that I create a clean and regular stitching line. If anybody were to look very closely to see those stitches, they must be very even. If you're using a sewing machine, well, then you're going to use your regular sewing machine stitch. We haven't gone through that at this point, but I want to show you how to do it by hand first. So I've stitched this seam right beside my marking line, but on this side, not this side, on this side, giving it about 1 millimeter of room. So this seam that I'm stitching right now is the finishing seam that you're after. So when you are creating a French seam, you have to plan ahead and work out your seam allowances so that you end up with the correct seam. Okay, so I'm going to end it here just for demonstration purposes. So I'm taking my last stitch, my last back stitch here, and I'm going to create a knot. I don't want to create a large knot. I'm just going to go through with my needle, hold that spot right at the end where I want the knot to end up, and pull gently, and the knot will end up very, very close to the end of that. And then I'm going to pass my needle through the layers here and bring it out through the layers so you don't see it. Pull that through and just give it a gentle tug, and then I can clip the thread, and we have the beginning of the seam and the end of the seam. Now from the back you can see all of these overlapped loops, and from the front here. So that is my finishing stitch. Okay, now the next step is that, yes, you're right, we're going to press that seam, but what we're going to do first before we press this seam is we're going to remove our basting line. If we press this seam properly, as I've shown you, this thread will leave an impression, and we don't want that to happen. So I'm just going to go ahead and remove that thread, and it's not very long. I just give it a tug and pull. It's easy to remove. Okay, so this is a nice long thread. I can use that again for basting. So I'm just going to put that aside, and now you can see the finishing of the stitch. Now let's have a look on the other side before I press it, just in case there's some adjustments that need to be made. I'm going to point out what might happen if you don't leave about 1 millimeter in between the edge, the raw edge, and the new seam. Okay, so this is all great, all hidden. Now here, do you see there's a little bit of thread that's come through? It's from the raw edge. Okay, so you don't want that to happen. You want to leave enough room so that any fibers are hidden in the trapped seam. It's a trapped seam. Okay, so now that is our finished seam, and I'm just going to give it a tug here before I finish it off and show you just how strong this seam is. It's amazing. It will last for years and years. Okay, so we're going to turn it back out, and we're going to finish off this seam by pressing. So I've put my seam, this is now my finished seam allowance. I'm putting it on my sleeve board and letting the fabric hang out of the way, and I'm going to have my press cloth, which is sufficiently dampened, and I'm just going to lay it over as far as the seam. I don't want to get any more impressions. Okay, now listen. Can you hear that? That is what you should be hearing. Now, this is good for cotton, linen, hemp, wool. Not so good for silk. There's another step that we take for silk, so don't try it for silk. So what we're trying to do is set the seam here, and we're going to give this another pressing. Now, I should have said feel that seam before you press it and feel it after you press it. You should notice a remarkable difference in the finish and the polish of that seam. Now go ahead and do the other side. Give that, just feel what that feels like, and then you're going to press it again with your ironing cloth, steam cloth, pressing cloth. And you're going to finish that seam off, and now go over with the hot iron, and that just removes whatever remaining steam there is. Now don't lift the fabric from pressing until the moisture has gone out. If you do, you're going to add wrinkles. So make sure that's all the steam has gone out and it's dry. Now go ahead and feel that again. It should feel almost imperceptible. You can still feel it, of course, but you can see there's a remarkable difference in how it feels, and that polished feel is what you're after. So that's step one. We've pressed that. Now we turn our sleeve back out, or whatever your garment is, and we're going to finish pressing from this side. But it doesn't require very much at this point. We've done most of the work. It's just a touch-up pressing at this point. If you've done it right, it's only a touch-up pressing. Now, what direction do you press the seam? Well, that very much depends on its location and its application. I'll go more into that in another video when we actually work on a garment. So you're going to put it on your board and you're going to push the fabric over on one side so it doesn't buckle, and you're going to take the tip of your iron and you're just going to do the same thing you did with your fingers with your iron, just in little bits and not too much pressure. This prevents any unsightly buckling first. Okay, so once you've got that trained, pressed over in one direction without any buckling or overhang, and it's all done, then you're going to finish that off with the pressing cloth again. Now here, this doesn't need to be too damp, but it does not need to be dry. Dry will have no purpose. Okay, so now we're just going to lay that over the seam. We're going to direct the point of the iron, the sharp end of the iron, and we're just going to go over that and finish that off. And I am avoiding this drop-off point here. So just concentrating on the seam line itself. If I go too far, I will create an impression on the front face, and I don't want to do that. If you accidentally do it, well, then you can turn it inside out and press it out again. Okay, so here is our finished seam, and it's very, very smooth. There's no buckling, and that is our French seam. Okay, so I've just left this open at this end so you can see how we began. This is our face side, and we began by putting our reverse faces together, which is counterintuitive to sewing most seams. So that's the first step. Then you sew your initial sewing line, and then you press and you create the marking line or the basting line for the seam in reverse, and then you have your French seam. So you can see that everything is folded inside, safe forever. That is the French seam in its very fundamental steps.